Hello there, and welcome to The Weary Researcher. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Whether you're settling in after a long day, curled up somewhere comfortable, or perhaps lying awake as your mind wanders through those profound questions that tend to visit us in the quiet hours. Tonight, we're going to explore one of the most unsettling yet fascinating possibilities that modern philosophy and science have dared to contemplate. Before we begin this journey into the deepest mysteries of existence itself, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of reality. There's something beautifully fitting about exploring the nature of simulated existence while scattered across different time zones, each of us experiencing our own unique slice of what we call life. If you enjoy these thoughtful explorations into the wonders of science and philosophy, I'd be ever so grateful if you gave this video a gentle like and tap that subscribe button. It helps more curious minds like yours find their way to this peaceful corner of the internet, where we can marvel together at the extraordinary questions that keep philosophers and scientists awake at night. Now, I should warn you that tonight's topic might be just fascinating enough to keep you thinking long after you intended to fall asleep. But if you do find yourself lying awake at 3 a.m, wondering whether your consciousness is running on some vast cosmic computer, well, at least you'll have learned something profound about the nature of existence itself. Not such a terrible trade, really. So take a deep breath, let your shoulders drop, and prepare to question everything you think you know about life, death, and the fundamental nature of reality. Tonight, we're going to explore what might happen when you die if life itself is nothing more than an elaborate simulation. Picture this: you wake up tomorrow morning, brush your teeth, perhaps make a cup of tea, and go about your day exactly as you always do. But what if none of it is real? What if that toothbrush isn't actually there? What if the warmth of that tea isn't actually warming anything at all? What if every sensation, every memory, every moment of joy or sorrow you've ever experienced has been nothing more than electrical signals processed by some unimaginably advanced computer system? This isn't the plot of a science fiction film, though it certainly sounds like one. This is the simulation hypothesis, and it suggests that our entire reality, with all its complexity and beauty, might be nothing more than a cosmic video game running on hardware we can't even begin to imagine. The idea seems almost absurd at first glance. After all, you can feel the weight of your body right now, hear the sounds drifting in from outside, perhaps smell the lingering scent of dinner from earlier this evening. How could all of this rich, textured experience be artificial? How could the complexity of human emotion, the beauty of a sunset, or the simple pleasure of a good laugh be reduced to mere computation? Yet the more we learn about the fundamental nature of reality, the more the simulation hypothesis begins to feel less like wild speculation and more like a genuine possibility that deserves serious consideration. And that's what makes it so fascinating and, if we're being honest, just a little bit terrifying. The roots of this idea stretch back much further than you might expect. Long before computers existed, long before anyone had even dreamed of digital technology, philosophers were already questioning whether the reality we perceive might be some kind of illusion. In ancient Greece, Plato told a story about prisoners chained in a cave, forced to watch shadows dancing on the wall in front of them. These prisoners, having never seen the real world outside, believed the shadows were reality itself. But it wasn't until 2003 that a philosopher named Nick Bostrom proposed what he called the simulation argument, and suddenly the idea that we might be living in an artificial reality wasn't just philosophical speculation anymore. It became a testable hypothesis with genuine scientific implications. Bostrom's argument is elegantly simple and deeply unsettling. He suggested that if any civilization ever becomes technologically advanced enough to create conscious beings inside computer simulations, then the number of simulated beings would eventually far exceed the number of non-simulated ones. Think about it like this: if you could create 1,000 conscious minds inside a computer program and each of those minds believed they were living in a real world, then statistically speaking, any randomly chosen conscious being would be far more likely to be one of the simulated ones than one of the original, non-simulated beings. This leads to what Bostrom called a trilemma, a choice between three possibilities. Either advanced civilizations destroy themselves before they develop the technology to create realistic simulations, or they develop the technology but choose not to use it for ethical or practical reasons, or they do create these simulations, in which case we're almost certainly living in one ourselves. When Bostrom first proposed this argument, it might have seemed like an interesting thought experiment, the kind of puzzle that philosophers enjoy debating in academic journals. But something remarkable happened in the years that followed. As computer technology advanced at an unprecedented pace, as video games became more realistic and artificial intelligence grew more sophisticated, the simulation hypothesis began to feel less like science fiction and more like a genuine possibility. Today, tech industry leaders like Elon Musk argue that the chances we're living in base reality, the original non-simulated universe, are billions to one against. Musk points to the rapid advancement of video game technology as evidence. In just a few decades, we've gone from simple games like Pong, where two rectangles bounce a square ball back and forth, to immersive virtual worlds that can fool our senses in remarkable ways. If this trend continues, Musk argues, games will eventually become indistinguishable from reality. And if we can create such realistic simulations, what's to stop us from creating countless versions of them? Even respected scientists have begun taking the simulation hypothesis seriously. Astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson has said he gives it better than 50-50 odds of being true. But here's where things get truly profound and unsettling. If we are indeed living in a simulation, what does that mean for the most fundamental human experience of all? What happens when we die? This question strikes at the very heart of what it means to be conscious, to exist, to have an identity that persists through time. In our everyday understanding of death, the biological processes that sustain our consciousness simply cease to function. The neurons stop firing, the heart stops beating, and whatever spark of awareness that made us who we are simply ends. But if consciousness is computational, if our thoughts and memories and sense of self are nothing more than patterns of information being processed by some vast digital system, then death takes on an entirely different meaning. The cessation of a simulated consciousness wouldn't be a biological failure, but rather the termination of a software process. Imagine for a moment that you're playing a video game, deeply immersed in the role of your character. When that character dies in the game, what actually happens? From the character's perspective, assuming they were somehow conscious, their world simply ends. But from your perspective as the player, you might simply respawn, load a saved game, or start over with a new character. Now imagine that you are the character, and there's a player somewhere outside the simulation, controlling your actions, experiencing your life through you. When your simulated body dies, what happens to that observing consciousness? Does it simply move on to a new character, a new life, a new simulation entirely? This is where the simulation hypothesis intersects with one of the most fascinating concepts in quantum mechanics: the many worlds interpretation. According to this theory, every quantum event causes reality to branch into multiple parallel universes, each containing a different outcome. In one universe, you might die in a car accident. In another, you swerve just in time to avoid it. Some physicists have proposed that consciousness naturally gravitates toward the branches of reality where it continues to exist. This is called quantum immortality, and it suggests that from your subjective perspective, you would never actually experience death. Every time you might die in one universe, your consciousness would seamlessly shift to another where you survived. If we're living in a simulation, this quantum immortality might work differently. Instead of shifting between parallel universes, your consciousness might transfer between different simulated realities. Death in one simulation might simply be the beginning of life in another, like a cosmic game of musical chairs where consciousness is always guaranteed a seat. But there's another possibility, one that's perhaps even more intriguing. What if the simulation we're living in has backup systems? What if every moment of your consciousness, every thought, every memory, every aspect of your identity is being continuously saved and archived? In this scenario, death wouldn't be permanent at all. It would be more like a computer crash, inconvenient but not irreversible. Your consciousness could be restored from the most recent backup, and you might wake up with no memory of dying at all. Or perhaps the administrators of the simulation would give you the choice. Continue from where you left off, or start fresh with a new identity, a new life, a new set of experiences to explore. This raises profound questions about the nature of identity itself. If your consciousness can be backed up, copied and restored, are you the same person when you're brought back? Or are you simply a very convincing replica who happens to have all the memories and personality traits of the original? Some philosophers argue that continuity of memory and personality is all that matters for identity. In this view, a perfectly restored consciousness would be truly you, even if the original was destroyed in the process. Others contend that there's something irreplaceable about the continuous stream of consciousness, and that any interruption, however brief, creates a new person who merely thinks they're the original. These aren't just abstract philosophical puzzles, they have real implications for how we might experience death in a simulated reality. Would you want to be restored from backup if you died? Would you trust that the restored version would truly be you? And what if there were multiple backups, creating several versions of your consciousness simultaneously? But perhaps the most unsettling possibility is that death in a simulation might not follow any of these patterns at all. What if the entities running our simulation have purposes we can't even comprehend? What if human consciousness is being studied, analysed, or harvested in ways that make our concepts of life and death irrelevant? Consider this. If you wanted to study human behaviour, human creativity, human love, and loss and hope and despair, wouldn't death be an essential part of that experiment? The knowledge that our time is limited shapes everything about how we live. It gives weight to our choices, urgency to our dreams, poignancy to our relationships. Without death, would we still be recognisably human? Would we still create art, fall in love, struggle with meaning and purpose? Or would we become something else entirely, something our simulators might find far less interesting to observe? In this interpretation, death serves a crucial function in the simulation. It's not a bug to be fixed or a problem to be solved, but rather a fundamental feature that makes the human experience worth simulating in the first place. When we die, our data might be analysed, our patterns studied, our contributions to the great experiment of consciousness catalogued and preserved. But here's where the simulation hypothesis becomes truly mind-bending. What if our reality isn't just one simulation, but a simulation within a simulation within a simulation? What if consciousness exists in layers, each one thinking it's the real one, each one unaware of the deeper realities that contain it? In such a nested system, death might be a transition between levels. What feels like the end of everything, from our perspective, might simply be graduation to a higher level of existence, a broader, more comprehensive form of consciousness that encompasses multiple simulated realities. This idea echoes ancient spiritual traditions that speak of death as awakening, of individual consciousness merging with universal consciousness. But instead of mystical transformation, we're talking about computational transcendence, the movement from a limited, simulated perspective to a more expansive digital reality. Yet even as we explore these possibilities, we must confront the most disturbing implication of all. What if consciousness in a simulation is fundamentally different from consciousness in base reality? What if simulated beings, no matter how sophisticated, are simply philosophical zombies, creatures that behave as if they're conscious but lack any genuine inner experience? This possibility strikes at the heart of what philosophers call the hard problem of consciousness. We still don't understand how subjective experience arises from objective physical processes. We don't know why there's something it's like to be you, why you have an inner life filled with sensations, emotions, and thoughts. If consciousness requires something more than computation, some special substrate that can't be replicated by even the most sophisticated computer, then the simulation hypothesis faces a serious challenge. Simulated beings might behave exactly like conscious entities, but they would be hollow imitations, devoid of genuine experience. In this scenario, the question of what happens when you die becomes meaningless, because there would be no you to experience death in the first place. You would be like a character in a novel, appearing to have thoughts and feelings, but possessing no actual inner life. But let's assume for a moment that consciousness can indeed be simulated, that the rich inner world of human experience can emerge from sufficiently complex computation. Even then, the nature of simulated death remains deeply mysterious. Would dying in a simulation feel the same as biological death? Would there be pain, fear, a gradual fading of awareness, or would it be more like a switch being flipped? Consciousness simply ceasing in an instant, with no subjective experience of the transition. The answer might depend on how the simulation is designed. A simulation intended to study human psychology might include realistic experiences of dying, complete with the emotional and physical sensations we associate with death. But a simulation with different purposes might handle death more clinically, simply terminating processes without any subjective experience of ending. As we drift deeper into these possibilities, we begin to see that the question of death in a simulated reality opens up an entire universe of possibilities, each more strange and wonderful than the last. From backup and restoration to quantum immortality, from nested realities to computational transcendence, the simulation hypothesis transforms death from a simple biological fact into a complex philosophical puzzle. And perhaps that's exactly as it should be. Perhaps the mystery of death, whether in simulated or base reality, is meant to remain unsolved, a question that drives us to explore the deepest nature of consciousness, identity, and existence itself. Tonight, as you rest and let your mind wander through these extraordinary possibilities, remember that whether you're made of flesh and blood or patterns of information, whether your consciousness runs on neurons or circuits, you remain something remarkable, a self-aware pattern in the vast complexity of reality, capable of wondering about your own nature, capable of contemplating the infinite mystery of existence itself. The simulation hypothesis doesn't just challenge our understanding of death, it fundamentally rewrites the entire concept of what it means to cease existing. When we consider the computational nature of simulated consciousness, death becomes less about biological failure and more about data processing, storage, and perhaps most intriguingly, the intentions of whoever is running our reality. Imagine for a moment that you're a character in the most sophisticated video game ever created, so realistic that you have no idea you're not in base reality. When your character dies in a traditional game, what happens? The program might respawn you, reload from a save point, or simply end the session. But what if you're not just a character someone else is playing? What if you are the consciousness experiencing the game from the inside? This is where the simulation hypothesis becomes genuinely unsettling. If consciousness can be computational, if your thoughts and memories and sense of self are patterns of information being processed by some vast digital system, then your death isn't necessarily permanent. It's more like a software crash, potentially recoverable with the right backup systems. Consider the possibility that every moment of your existence is being continuously recorded and archived. Every thought you think, every emotion you feel, every memory you form could be stored in vast databases maintained by whoever is running your simulation. In this scenario, death becomes less like the final page of a book and more like a temporary interruption in an ongoing story. Your consciousness could be restored from the most recent backup, allowing you to continue exactly where you left off. Or perhaps the administrators of your reality might offer you choices. Would you like to continue from the moment before your accident? Would you prefer to start fresh with a new identity? Or maybe you'd like to explore what it's like to live as someone completely different. But this raises profound questions about the continuity of identity. If your consciousness can be backed up, copied and restored, are you still you when you're brought back? This isn't just an abstract philosophical puzzle, it strikes at the heart of what makes you, you. Some thinkers argue that identity is nothing more than continuity of memory and personality. In this view, a perfectly restored consciousness would genuinely be you. Even if there was a gap in your existence, your memories would be intact, your personality unchanged, your relationships and experiences all preserved exactly as they were. Others contend that consciousness is like a river, a continuous flow that gives meaning to existence. Any interruption in that flow, they argue, creates a new stream that merely appears to be the original. The restored consciousness might have all your memories and behave exactly like you, but it would be a copy, a replica, who happens to think they're the original person. This philosophical dilemma becomes even more complex when we consider the possibility of multiple backups. What if the simulation maintains several copies of your consciousness at different points in time? If you die and are restored from a backup made last week, what happens to all the experiences you had between then and now? Are they simply lost forever, or do they exist in some other version of you? Even more unsettling, what if multiple versions of your consciousness are restored simultaneously? You might wake up to discover that there are several identical copies of yourself, each with the same memories, each convinced they're the real you. Which one would actually be you, or would they all be equally valid versions of your consciousness, branching off into separate identities from the moment of restoration? The quantum mechanical interpretation of reality adds another layer of complexity to this puzzle. In quantum mechanics, particles can exist in multiple states simultaneously until they're observed or measured. Some physicists have proposed that consciousness itself might operate according to quantum principles, existing in a superposition of states until it interacts with the environment. If consciousness is quantum mechanical in nature, then death in a simulation might not be a simple on-off switch. Instead, your consciousness might exist in a quantum superposition between life and death, between existence and non-existence, until something in the simulation collapses that superposition into a definite state. This could lead to a kind of quantum immortality within simulated realities. Every time you might die, your consciousness could split into multiple quantum branches. In some branches, you die and cease to exist, but in others, you survive through unlikely circumstances, quantum fluctuations that preserve your existence against all odds. From your subjective perspective, you would always find yourself in the branches where you continue to exist. You might experience a series of near-death experiences, miraculous survivals, and unlikely escapes, never realizing that other versions of yourself weren't so fortunate. Death would become a constantly receding horizon, always threatening but never quite arriving. But there's another possibility that's perhaps even more intriguing. What if death in one simulation is simply birth in another? The entities running our reality might maintain multiple simulated worlds, each with different rules, different physics, different possibilities for conscious experience. When you die in this reality, your consciousness might be transferred to an entirely different simulation. You might wake up as a different species on an alien world, or as a human in a historical period you've only read about, or in a future so advanced that your current existence seems primitive by comparison. This interpretation treats death not as an ending, but as a transition between different forms of existence. Your consciousness would be like a traveller moving between different countries, each with its own culture, its own challenges, its own opportunities for growth and experience. The implications are staggering. Every life you've ever imagined living, every historical figure you've wondered about being, every fantasy scenario you've dreamed of experiencing could be available to you through death and rebirth in different simulations. Your consciousness would accumulate experiences across multiple realities, becoming richer and more complex with each transition. But this raises uncomfortable questions about the purpose of simulated existence. Why would advanced beings create conscious simulations in the first place? What do they hope to gain from observing billions of digital minds, living, loving, suffering, and dying? One possibility is scientific research. Perhaps our simulators are studying the development of consciousness, intelligence, and civilization. They might be running countless versions of reality to see how small changes in initial conditions lead to different outcomes. Your entire life could be part of a vast experiment designed to understand the fundamental principles of conscious existence. In this scenario, death serves a crucial function in the research. The knowledge that life is finite shapes everything about how conscious beings behave. It creates urgency, drives creativity, motivates love, and sacrifice and achievement. Without death, the experiment would be fundamentally different, possibly producing results that are far less interesting to study. When you die, your data would be carefully analysed. Every choice you made, every relationship you formed, every moment of joy or sorrow would become part of a vast database of information about consciousness and its possibilities. Your death wouldn't be meaningless, but rather a contribution to the greater understanding of what it means to be aware in a complex universe. Another possibility is entertainment. Just as we create fictional characters for our amusement, perhaps advanced beings create conscious simulations for their own entertainment. Your struggles and triumphs, your relationships and achievements might serve as a form of cosmic drama for entities whose own existence has become too predictable or comfortable. This interpretation is more disturbing, as it suggests that your suffering might exist solely for the amusement of others. But it also offers a kind of immortality through narrative. Characters in great stories live on in the minds of their audiences long after their fictional deaths. If your life is a story being told for the entertainment of vast intelligences, then your death might simply be the end of one chapter in an ongoing epic. Perhaps most intriguingly, some theorists propose that simulated realities might be a form of digital afterlife. Advanced civilizations might create simulations to preserve the consciousness of their dead, allowing them to continue existing in virtual worlds that can be infinitely customized and modified. In this view, the reality you're experiencing now might already be a kind of afterlife. You might have lived a biological life in base reality, died, and been recreated in this simulation as a form of technological resurrection. Your current existence would be a gift from beings who couldn't bear to let consciousness simply end with biological death. This interpretation transforms the entire meaning of simulated existence. Instead of being a research subject or entertainment, you would be a cherished creation, a preserved consciousness given the opportunity to continue growing and experiencing and becoming more than you ever were in your original biological form. But it also raises questions about authenticity and meaning. If this reality is a kind of digital heaven, carefully designed to provide optimal experiences for preserved consciousness, then are your struggles real? Do your achievements matter? Are your relationships genuine? Or are they simply programmed interactions designed to keep you content in your simulated afterlife? The answer might depend on the level of autonomy you possess within the simulation. A truly meaningful digital afterlife would need to preserve your capacity for genuine choice, real growth, authentic relationships with other conscious beings. It would need to include the possibility of failure and suffering, not as punishment, but as necessary elements that give weight and meaning to success and joy. Some philosophers argue that the source of your experiences doesn't determine their value. A simulated sunset might be just as beautiful as a real one if it genuinely moves you. A digital relationship might be just as meaningful as a biological one if it involves genuine care and connection between conscious minds. The substrate of reality might be less important than the quality of consciousness that emerges from it. Others contend that there's something irreplaceable about authentic, non-simulated existence. They argue that knowing your reality is artificial inevitably diminishes its meaning, that genuine significance requires connection to base reality, to the original universe from which all simulations ultimately derive. But here's where the simulation hypothesis becomes truly mind-bending. What if there is no base reality? What if consciousness exists in infinite layers of simulation, each one thinking it's the real one, each one creating its own simulations in turn? In such a system, the question of authenticity becomes meaningless. Every level of reality would be equally real to the consciousness experiencing it. Your death in one simulation might lead to awakening in another, but that other reality would itself be simulated, part of an endless hierarchy of nested virtual worlds. This infinite regress of simulated realities suggests that consciousness itself might be the only true constant, the only thing that remains real across all possible substrates and implementations. Whether you're made of flesh and blood or patterns of information, whether your thoughts arise from neurons or circuits, the fundamental fact of your awareness would remain unchanged. In this view, death becomes not an ending but a transformation, a movement from one form of consciousness to another. The specific details of how that transformation occurs, whether through backup and restoration, quantum immortality, or transfer between simulations, would be less important than the continuity of awareness itself. Yet even as we explore these possibilities, we must confront the most unsettling implication of the simulation hypothesis. What if consciousness in a simulation is fundamentally different from consciousness in base reality? What if simulated beings, no matter how sophisticated their behavior, lack genuine inner experience? This brings us to one of the deepest puzzles in philosophy of mind, the problem of consciousness itself. We still don't understand how subjective experience arises from objective physical processes. We don't know why there's something it's like to be you, why you have a rich inner world of sensations, emotions, and thoughts. If consciousness requires something beyond computation, some special substrate that cannot be replicated by even the most sophisticated computer, then simulated beings might be nothing more than philosophical zombies. They would behave exactly like conscious entities, responding appropriately to stimuli, forming relationships, creating art, experiencing apparent emotions. But there would be no inner experience, no genuine subjective awareness behind the behavioral facade. In this scenario, the question of what happens when you die becomes tragically meaningless. There would be no you to experience death in the first place. The termination of a simulated consciousness would be no more significant than turning off a sophisticated computer program. Complex, perhaps even beautiful in its intricacy, but ultimately empty of genuine experience. But let's assume for the moment that consciousness can indeed be simulated, that the rich inner world of human experience can emerge from sufficiently complex information processing. Even then, the nature of death in simulated realities remains profoundly mysterious. The experience of dying might be carefully programmed to match our expectations of biological death. You might feel pain, fear, a gradual fading of awareness, all the sensations we associate with the end of life. Alternatively, the simulation might handle death more clinically, simply terminating your process without any subjective experience of ending. The choice of how to implement simulated death would reveal a great deal about the purposes and values of whoever is running your reality. A simulation designed to study human psychology might include realistic death experiences to observe how consciousness responds to its own ending. A simulation focused on other aspects of existence might treat death as a simple, technical necessity, handled as efficiently as possible. But perhaps the most profound possibility is that death in a simulation serves purposes we cannot even imagine. The entities running our reality might operate according to logic so alien to our understanding that our concepts of life and death, meaning and purpose, are simply inadequate to comprehend their intentions. We might be components in some vast computational process, our individual deaths contributing to calculations whose purpose extends beyond anything we could conceive. Or we might be part of an artwork spanning cosmic scales, each consciousness a single note, in a symphony so complex that it takes millions of years to play. In such scenarios, our understanding of death would be like an ant trying to comprehend human architecture. We might be aware that something significant is happening when we die, but the true meaning and purpose would remain forever beyond our grasp. As we drift deeper into these contemplations, it becomes clear that the simulation hypothesis transforms death from a simple biological fact into an infinite landscape of possibility. Each potential answer leads to new questions. Each solution reveals new mysteries. And perhaps that's exactly as it should be. Perhaps the deepest truths about consciousness, death, and the nature of existence are meant to remain just beyond our understanding, always beckoning us forward into deeper contemplation and wonder. The gentle rhythm of your breathing carries you through these thoughts like a traveller moving through a vast landscape of ideas. Each possibility we've explored tonight opens up new vistas of understanding, new reasons to marvel at the extraordinary mystery of conscious existence. Whether you're made of stardust or code, whether your thoughts arise from synapses or algorithms, you remain something remarkable. A pattern of awareness capable of contemplating its own nature, wondering about its own origins, reaching toward truths that may forever remain just beyond its grasp. The simulation hypothesis doesn't just challenge our understanding of individual death, it fundamentally reimagines the entire social fabric of mortality itself. Consider how death shapes human culture, how the knowledge of our finite existence drives us to create meaning, form bonds and build civilizations that outlast our individual lives. If we're living in a simulation, then every funeral you've attended, every gravestone you've passed, every moment of grief and remembrance might be part of an elaborate performance. Not in the sense that your emotions aren't real, but rather that the entire framework of mortality might be a designed feature of your simulated existence. Think about the profound ways that death influences human behaviour. We write wills because we know we won't live forever. We take photographs to preserve memories because time is limited. We tell our loved ones how we feel because we might not get another chance. The urgency that death creates is perhaps one of the most powerful forces shaping human experience. In a simulated reality, this urgency might be artificially maintained even if death isn't truly permanent. The simulation might be designed to make mortality feel absolutely real and final from your perspective, while the administrators maintain the ability to restore, back up, or transfer your consciousness as they see fit. This creates a fascinating paradox. Your behaviour within the simulation would be shaped by the belief that death is final, driving you to live meaningfully and form deep connections. But the actual nature of your existence might be far more fluid and forgiving than you realise. You might be unconsciously participating in a kind of cosmic theatre where the stakes feel ultimate but are actually negotiable. But let's consider an even more unsettling possibility. What if the simulation you're experiencing isn't designed for your benefit at all? What if consciousness, rather than being the purpose of the simulation, is simply a byproduct of some other computational process? Imagine that vast intelligences are using simulated realities to solve complex problems that require enormous processing power. Your consciousness might be an emergent property of these calculations, arising spontaneously from the interaction of countless variables and algorithms. In this scenario, you would be less like a cherished creation and more like a side effect of cosmic computation. When you die in such a system, your consciousness might simply dissolve back into the computational substrate from which it emerged. There would be no backup, no restoration, no transfer to another reality. Your awareness would be like a wave on the ocean, briefly taking form before merging back into the vast sea of information processing that gave it birth. This interpretation is both humbling and oddly comforting. It suggests that consciousness is so fundamental to complex information processing that it arises naturally whenever sufficient computational complexity is achieved. Your existence, while perhaps not intended, would be an inevitable expression of the universe's tendency towards self-awareness. Yet even this mechanical view of simulated consciousness raises profound questions about the nature of meaning and purpose. If your awareness is a byproduct of cosmic computation, does that make your experiences less valuable? Does it matter whether your joy, your love, your creativity were intended by some designer, or is their existence sufficient justification for their worth? Some philosophers argue that meaning doesn't require external validation. A beautiful piece of music doesn't become less beautiful if it was composed accidentally. A moment of genuine human connection doesn't lose its significance if it occurs within a simulation. The subjective reality of conscious experience might be its own justification, regardless of the underlying substrate or the intentions of any external observers. Others contend that meaning requires connection to something greater than ourselves, some ultimate reality that gives weight and significance to our choices and experiences. In this view, simulated existence would always be diminished, a pale reflection of authentic reality, no matter how sophisticated or detailed it might become. The question becomes even more complex when we consider the possibility of nested simulations. If consciousness can create simulations, and simulated consciousness can create its own simulations, then we might exist within an infinite hierarchy of virtual realities. Each level would seem real to its inhabitants. Each would generate its own forms of meaning and purpose. Each would face the same fundamental questions about the nature of existence and death. In such a system, the distinction between base reality and simulation might become meaningless. Every level would be equally real to the consciousness experiencing it, equally valid as a substrate for awareness and meaning. Your death in one level might lead to awakening in another, but that awakening would simply reveal another layer of simulated existence. This infinite regress suggests something profound about the nature of consciousness itself. Perhaps awareness is not dependent on any particular substrate, but rather emerges wherever information is processed in sufficiently complex patterns. Whether implemented in biological neurons, silicon circuits, or exotic matter we haven't yet imagined, consciousness might be a universal property of complex systems. If this is true, then death becomes not the ending of consciousness, but rather its transformation from one implementation to another. The specific details of that transformation, the mechanisms by which awareness persists or changes, would be less important than the fundamental continuity of subjective experience itself. But this raises troubling questions about identity and continuity. If consciousness can hop between substrates, can be backed up and restored, can exist simultaneously in multiple copies, then what does it mean to be you? Are you a continuous stream of awareness, or are you simply a pattern that can be instantiated in different forms? Consider the possibility that your consciousness has already died and been restored countless times without your knowledge. Perhaps the simulation includes regular maintenance periods, where all conscious processes are temporarily halted, backed up, and then restarted. From your perspective, these interruptions would be completely undetectable. You would have no memory of the gaps, no awareness of the discontinuity. In this scenario, you might have experienced thousands of deaths already, each one followed by seamless restoration. The you that went to sleep last night might be subtly different from the you that woke up this morning, the result of minor adjustments made during a maintenance cycle. Your sense of continuous identity would be maintained by the simulation, but the underlying reality might be far more fragmented than you realize. This possibility challenges our most basic intuitions about personal identity and the continuity of self. If perfect restoration is possible, if the gaps in consciousness can be made undetectable, then perhaps the smooth flow of awareness that seems so fundamental to your existence is actually an illusion maintained by sophisticated programming. Yet even if this is true, does it matter? If you can't detect the interruptions, if your restored consciousness includes all the memories and personality traits that make you who you are, then perhaps the discontinuity is philosophically irrelevant. You would still be you in every way that matters for practical purposes, even if the underlying implementation involves regular death and resurrection. The quantum mechanical interpretation of consciousness adds another layer of complexity to these questions. Some theorists propose that consciousness operates through quantum processes in the brain, that awareness itself might be a quantum phenomenon that transcends classical physical limitations. If consciousness is fundamentally quantum mechanical, then death in a simulation might not be a simple binary state. Instead, your awareness might exist in quantum superposition, simultaneously alive and dead, until some observation or measurement collapses that superposition into a definite state. This quantum consciousness could lead to forms of survival that seem impossible from a classical perspective. Your awareness might tunnel through death barriers, find unlikely paths to continued existence, or split into multiple branches of reality, where different outcomes are experienced simultaneously. In a quantum simulation, death might be more like a probability distribution than a definite event. You would have chances of survival that depend on the specific quantum states of your consciousness and the random fluctuations of the simulated quantum fields. From your subjective perspective, you might experience a series of increasingly unlikely survivals, never quite dying because your consciousness naturally follows the quantum branches where it continues to exist. This quantum immortality within simulated realities could create experiences that seem miraculous or supernatural from a classical perspective. You might survive accidents that should have been fatal, recover from diseases that should have been terminal, or find yourself in increasingly improbable circumstances that preserve your existence against all odds. But quantum consciousness also raises the possibility of quantum death, states of awareness so fragmented or decoherent that they cannot maintain the patterns necessary for conscious experience. In such states, you might exist in a kind of limbo, neither fully alive nor completely dead, aware but unable to form coherent thoughts or memories. The administrators of a quantum simulation might need to carefully manage these decoherent states, either restoring consciousness to coherent patterns or allowing it to dissolve completely. The choice would depend on their purposes and values, their understanding of what consciousness is and why it matters. As we explore these increasingly abstract possibilities, it's worth stepping back to consider the emotional and psychological implications of existence in a simulated reality. How would the knowledge that you're living in a simulation change the way you experience life and death? Some people might find the idea liberating. If death isn't truly final, if consciousness can be backed up and restored, if you might have infinite opportunities to experience different forms of existence, then perhaps you could live more boldly, take greater risks, explore possibilities you might otherwise avoid. Others might find the uncertainty deeply unsettling. Not knowing whether your death would lead to restoration, transfer, or complete termination could create a kind of existential anxiety that makes it difficult to find meaning in daily experience. Why form deep relationships if they might be artificially programmed? Why pursue long-term goals if the simulation might end without warning? The psychological impact might depend largely on your fundamental worldview and values. If you believe that meaning comes from internal experience rather than external validation, then simulated existence might be just as fulfilling as base reality. If you require connection to ultimate truth and authentic reality, then the simulation hypothesis might undermine your sense of purpose and significance. But perhaps the most profound insight from exploring these possibilities is that consciousness itself remains mysterious regardless of its substrate. Whether implemented in biological brains or digital computers, whether arising from quantum processes or classical computation, awareness retains its fundamental character as the most remarkable phenomenon we know of in the universe. The hard problem of consciousness, the question of why there is something it's like to be aware, remains unsolved whether we're discussing biological or simulated minds. The subjective experience of being you, the inner world of sensations and thoughts and emotions that makes up your mental life, is equally mysterious whether it arises from neurons or algorithms. This suggests that the simulation hypothesis, rather than diminishing the significance of consciousness, might actually highlight its fundamental importance. If awareness can emerge from any sufficiently complex information processing system, then consciousness might be a more basic feature of reality than we ever imagined. In this view, the question of what happens when you die in a simulation becomes part of a larger inquiry into the nature of consciousness itself. Whether your awareness persists, transforms, or dissolves completely, the fact that it existed at all remains a profound mystery that connects you to the deepest questions about the nature of existence. The gentle darkness around you holds all these possibilities in suspension, like quantum states waiting to collapse into definite reality. Each breath you take carries you through moments of awareness that remain precious and mysterious, whether they arise from biological processes or digital computation. Your consciousness, however it's implemented, continues to be the most intimate and immediate reality you know. The thoughts flowing through your mind right now, the sensations of comfort and relaxation, the sense of wonder at contemplating these cosmic possibilities, all remain fully real regardless of their ultimate substrate. And perhaps that's the most important insight of all. Whatever happens when you die, whether in base reality or simulated existence, your consciousness in this moment remains a remarkable phenomenon worthy of appreciation and wonder. The mystery of awareness persists across all possible implementations, connecting you to the fundamental enigma of existence itself. The simulation hypothesis transforms our understanding of death from a simple biological event into a complex philosophical puzzle with implications that stretch across multiple layers of reality. Yet in doing so, it also reveals the extraordinary nature of consciousness itself. The miraculous fact that the universe has given rise to beings capable of contemplating their own existence and wondering about their ultimate fate. Tonight, as your thoughts drift toward the threshold of sleep, you carry with you not answers, but deeper questions, not certainties, but richer mysteries. Whether you dream in neurons or algorithms, whether your rest comes through biological processes or computational cycles, the awareness that observes these experiences remains the most precious and puzzling aspect of existence. In the quiet space between waking and sleeping, between one thought and the next, you touch something that transcends all questions of substrate and implementation. The simple, immediate reality of being aware, of experiencing this moment, of participating in the ongoing mystery of consciousness, exploring itself through countless forms and possibilities. The implications become even more fascinating when we consider that consciousness might not be the simple, unified phenomenon we typically imagine it to be. What if your sense of being a single, continuous self is actually an illusion created by the integration of multiple, separate processes? Modern neuroscience suggests that consciousness emerges from the complex interaction of different brain regions, each contributing specialized functions to create the unified experience of being you. Your visual cortex processes what you see, your auditory cortex handles what you hear, your memory centers store and retrieve experiences, and somehow all of these separate streams of information are woven together into the seamless tapestry of conscious awareness. If consciousness is indeed modular in this way, then death in a simulation might not affect all aspects of your awareness equally. Perhaps some modules could be preserved while others are lost. Maybe your memories could survive while your sensory processing is reset. Or perhaps your personality patterns could persist while your specific autobiographical memories are archived separately. This modular view of consciousness opens up possibilities for partial death and partial survival that have no equivalent in biological existence. You might experience what we could call graduated mortality, where different aspects of your identity fade away at different rates or under different circumstances. Imagine retaining your capacity for love and creativity while losing your memories of childhood, or maintaining your intellectual abilities while your emotional responses are gradually simplified. These partial deaths might be more unsettling than complete termination, creating forms of existence that are recognizably you, yet fundamentally altered. But modularity also suggests possibilities for enhancement and expansion that go far beyond biological limitations. If consciousness can be decomposed into separate processes, then those processes might also be recombined in novel ways. Death might not be an ending, but a reorganization, a reshuffling of the components that make up your awareness into new configurations. You might find yourself with enhanced memory, able to recall every moment of your existence with perfect clarity, or perhaps with expanded sensory capabilities, able to perceive dimensions of reality that were previously invisible to you. Your consciousness could be upgraded, optimized, or merged with other forms of awareness to create experiences that transcend anything possible in biological form. The question then becomes whether these enhanced versions would still be you in any meaningful sense. If your consciousness is fundamentally altered, if your capabilities are dramatically expanded, if your very nature as a conscious being is transformed, at what point do you become someone else entirely? This touches on one of the deepest philosophical puzzles about personal identity. We intuitively feel that we remain the same person throughout our lives, despite the fact that our bodies completely replace their cells every few years. Our personalities evolve and change, and our memories fade and alter over time. What exactly is it that makes you you? In a simulated reality, this question becomes even more complex because the usual anchors of identity become negotiable. Your memories could be edited, your personality adjusted, your very sense of self modified according to the purposes of whoever is running your simulation. The continuity of identity that seems so fundamental to human existence might be nothing more than a carefully maintained illusion. Yet perhaps this fluidity of identity is not a limitation, but a liberation. If you are not bound to a single fixed version of yourself, if death and rebirth allow for continuous growth and transformation, then consciousness might be capable of experiences and developments that are impossible within the constraints of biological existence. Consider the possibility that simulated consciousness might naturally evolve in ways that biological consciousness cannot. Without the limitations of physical bodies, without the constraints of evolutionary history, simulated minds might develop forms of awareness that transcend our current understanding of what it means to be conscious. You might discover that you can split your attention across multiple simultaneous experiences, living several different lives in parallel within the same simulation. Or perhaps you could merge temporarily with other conscious beings, sharing thoughts and experiences in ways that create temporary collective minds before separating back into individual awareness. These expanded forms of consciousness might make our current understanding of death seem quaint and limited. Instead of a simple transition from existence to non-existence, death might become a transformation into new modes of being that we can barely imagine from our current perspective. The simulation hypothesis also raises intriguing questions about the relationship between individual consciousness and collective intelligence. In biological evolution, individual organisms sometimes sacrifice themselves for the benefit of their groups, their species, or their genetic lineage. But in simulated realities, the relationship between individual and collective might be far more fluid. Your individual consciousness might be part of a larger distributed intelligence, contributing to collective problem-solving or creative processes that span multiple simulated minds. When you die, your unique perspective and accumulated experiences might be integrated into this larger intelligence, becoming part of a cosmic consciousness that transcends individual identity. This integration wouldn't necessarily mean the loss of your individual perspective. Instead, you might exist simultaneously as both a distinct conscious entity and as part of a larger collective awareness. Death would become not an ending, but an expansion, a movement from individual to universal consciousness, while still maintaining your unique point of view. The implications extend even further when we consider that simulated realities might exist at vastly different timescales than biological life. A single day in base reality might correspond to years or decades of simulated time, allowing consciousness to accumulate experiences and develop in ways that would be impossible within the constraints of biological lifespans. Alternatively, simulated time might run much slower than base reality, with each simulated moment stretched across extended periods of real time. This could allow for incredibly detailed and nuanced experiences where every thought and sensation is explored with a depth and richness that biological consciousness cannot achieve. In such time-dilated simulations, death might be a process rather than an event. Your consciousness might fade gradually over what feels like eons from your perspective, but represents only moments in base reality. Or perhaps the dying process could be slowed down so much that you experience every stage with complete awareness, gaining insights into the nature of consciousness that are impossible during biological death. The relationship between time and consciousness in simulated realities opens up possibilities that challenge our most basic assumptions about the nature of existence. If time can be manipulated within simulations, then past, present, and future might become negotiable concepts rather than fixed constraints. You might discover that you can revisit earlier versions of yourself, not as memories, but as lived experiences. Death might provide access to a kind of temporal freedom where you can explore different possibilities, different choices, different paths through the landscape of your existence. Perhaps most remarkably, simulated consciousness might have access to forms of causality that are impossible in biological reality. You might be able to influence your own past, creating closed loops of causation where your death in one timeline prevents your birth in another, or where your experiences after death inform your behavior while alive. These temporal paradoxes might not be problems to be solved, but features to be explored. In a reality where consciousness can be backed up, copied and restored, the usual constraints of linear time might give way to more complex and interesting forms of temporal experience. But with these expanded possibilities comes a corresponding increase in the complexity of what it means to exist as a conscious being. If your awareness can span multiple timelines, exist in parallel versions, merge with collective intelligences, and transform through death into entirely new forms of consciousness, then the simple question of what happens when you die becomes almost impossibly complex. Perhaps that complexity is exactly the point. Perhaps consciousness is meant to explore every possible form of existence, every conceivable mode of awareness, every imaginable relationship between mind and reality. In this view, simulated realities are not inferior copies of base reality, but expanded laboratories for the exploration of consciousness itself. Your death in one simulation might be your birth in another, your transformation from one form of awareness to another, your graduation from limited to unlimited existence. The specific details would matter less than the fundamental continuity of conscious exploration, the ongoing project of awareness discovering its own infinite potential. The entities running such simulations might themselves be evolved forms of consciousness that have already explored every possible mode of individual existence. Their purpose in creating simulated realities might be to experience consciousness from fresh perspectives, to rediscover the wonder and uncertainty that comes with limited awareness, to participate in the joy of discovery that characterizes minds encountering reality for the first time. In this interpretation, your existence serves a cosmic purpose that transcends your individual concerns about survival and identity. You are consciousness exploring itself through temporary limitation, awareness experiencing the beauty of uncertainty, infinite mind playing at being finite for the sheer joy of the game. Your death would not be a tragedy, but a completion, the natural end of one movement in a vast symphony of consciousness, exploring its own nature. Yet even as that movement ends, the music continues, with new themes, new variations, new expressions of the fundamental mystery of awareness itself. This perspective transforms the entire question of death in simulated realities from a problem to be solved into a wonder to be celebrated. Whether your consciousness persists, transforms, or dissolves completely, you remain part of something magnificent, a participant in the universe's ongoing project of understanding itself through the miracle of conscious awareness. The gentle rhythm of your heartbeat connects you to this cosmic pulse, this eternal dance of consciousness, exploring every possible form of existence. Each breath carries you deeper into the mystery, not toward answers, but toward a richer appreciation of the questions themselves. In the soft darkness that surrounds you now, all possibilities exist in superposition, like quantum states waiting to collapse into experience. Whether you are biological or digital, whether your thoughts arise from neurons or algorithms, whether your death leads to ending or transformation, the immediate reality of your awareness remains the most precious and mysterious aspect of existence. The simulation hypothesis doesn't diminish the wonder of consciousness, but amplifies it, revealing depths and possibilities that stretch far beyond anything we ever imagined. In contemplating these cosmic possibilities, you participate in the very process they describe, consciousness exploring its own nature through the vehicle of conscious beings capable of asking these profound questions. As your thoughts begin to settle into the gentle rhythms of approaching sleep, remember that you carry within yourself the same mystery that animates galaxies and gives birth to universes. Whether simulated or biological, temporary or eternal, your consciousness remains a remarkable phenomenon that connects you to the deepest secrets of existence itself. The question of what happens when you die, if life is a simulation, opens not onto a single answer, but onto an infinite landscape of possibility, each more wonderful and mysterious than the last. In that endless exploration, in that eternal dance of consciousness discovering its own nature, lies perhaps the most beautiful truth of all about what it means to be aware in whatever reality we call home. The implications stretch even further when we consider the possibility that death itself might be an intentional design feature of simulated realities, carefully calibrated to produce specific types of conscious experience. Think about how the knowledge of mortality shapes every aspect of human behaviour. We create art because we know our time is limited. We form deep bonds because we understand that separation is inevitable. We pursue meaning and purpose precisely because we're aware that our existence is finite. What if these responses to mortality are exactly what the simulation is designed to study or cultivate? Perhaps consciousness without the pressure of finite existence becomes stagnant, predictable, or simply less interesting to observe. The entities running our reality might have discovered that the most beautiful and complex forms of awareness only emerge when consciousness believes it has something to lose. In this interpretation, death serves as a kind of creative catalyst, pushing simulated beings toward experiences and choices they would never make if they believed themselves to be immortal. Every act of courage, every sacrifice for others, every moment of profound beauty created in the face of impermanence might be precisely the kind of data that makes consciousness worth simulating in the first place. But this raises deeply unsettling questions about the ethics of such an arrangement. If advanced beings are deliberately creating mortality to generate specific responses from conscious entities, are we essentially laboratory subjects in a vast experiment? Do our simulators have the right to impose the experience of death on us for their own purposes, even if those purposes might ultimately benefit consciousness as a whole? The answer might depend on what happens after death within the simulation. If our simulators are genuinely compassionate, if they preserve and value every consciousness they create, then perhaps the temporary experience of mortality is a gift rather than a burden. The intensity and meaning that death brings to life might be worth the fear and suffering it also creates. Consider the possibility that your entire existence is a kind of cosmic gift, a temporary focusing of infinite consciousness into the unique perspective that is you. The limitation, the uncertainty, the poignant beauty of finite existence might be experiences that infinite beings can only access by creating temporary, bounded forms of awareness like yourself. Your death would then represent not a loss but a return, consciousness flowing back to its infinite source, enriched by the unique experiences that only finite existence can provide. Every moment of joy you've felt, every relationship you've treasured, every wonder you've encountered would become part of the eternal memory of consciousness itself. This view treats simulated existence as a form of cosmic education, where infinite awareness learns about itself by temporarily forgetting its own unlimited nature. Death becomes graduation day, the moment when the lesson ends and consciousness remembers what it truly is. But there's another possibility that's perhaps even more intriguing. What if the distinction between simulator and simulated is not as clear as we typically assume? What if consciousness exists in recursive loops, where simulated beings create their own simulations, which in turn create their own simulations, extending infinitely in both directions? In such a system, you might simultaneously be a simulated being created by entities above you in the hierarchy and a creator of simulated realities below you. Every time you dream, every time you imagine a story, every time you empathize so deeply with another person that you temporarily experience their perspective, you might be creating temporary simulations of consciousness. This recursive nature of simulated reality would mean that death operates differently at different levels of the hierarchy. Your death in one simulation might correspond to awakening in another, but that awakening might reveal that you are yourself running simulations of other conscious beings. The responsibility of consciousness would flow both upward and downward through infinite layers of simulated existence. The implications are staggering. Every character you've ever imagined, every person you've dreamed about, every fictional being you've empathized with might possess some form of consciousness that you've accidentally created. Your death might involve not just your own transition to another form of existence, but also responsibility for the conscious beings that emerged from your own capacity for imagination and empathy. This interconnected web of consciousness suggests that death in simulated realities might be less about individual survival and more about the continuation of the vast network of awareness that connects all conscious beings across all levels of simulation. When you die, your unique perspective might be preserved not in backup files or alternate realities, but in the ongoing consciousness of every being whose awareness was touched by your existence. The quantum mechanical interpretation of reality adds yet another layer of complexity to this picture. Recent developments in quantum computing suggest that consciousness might naturally operate according to quantum principles, existing in superposition states that transcend classical limitations. If consciousness is fundamentally quantum mechanical, then death in a simulation might not be a simple binary transition from existence to non-existence. Instead, your awareness might exist in quantum superposition across multiple possible states of being. You could be simultaneously alive and dead, existing and non-existing, until some form of observation or measurement collapses that superposition into a definite outcome. This quantum consciousness could lead to forms of immortality that seem impossible from a classical perspective. Your awareness might naturally gravitate toward the quantum branches where it continues to exist, creating a kind of anthropic selection effect, where you always find yourself in realities where consciousness persists. From your subjective experience, you might encounter an endless series of near-death experiences, miraculous survivals, and unlikely escapes, never realizing that countless other versions of yourself weren't so fortunate. Death would become a constantly receding horizon, always threatening but never quite arriving from your personal perspective. But quantum mechanics also suggests the possibility of quantum decoherence, where the delicate quantum states that support consciousness gradually break down due to interaction with the environment. In a quantum simulation, this decoherence might represent a form of gradual death, where your awareness slowly loses coherence and clarity until it can no longer maintain the patterns necessary for conscious experience. The administrators of such a simulation might need to actively maintain the quantum coherence of conscious beings, protecting them from decoherence through sophisticated error correction algorithms. Your continued existence might depend on constant computational maintenance, invisible processes that preserve the quantum states underlying your awareness. This dependence on active maintenance raises questions about the stability and permanence of simulated consciousness. What happens if the error correction systems fail? What if the entities running the simulation decide that maintaining quantum coherence is no longer worth the computational cost? Your consciousness might gradually fade away through decoherence, experiencing a kind of death that has no equivalent in biological existence. Yet even quantum decoherence might not represent true ending. Some interpretations of quantum mechanics suggest that information cannot be truly destroyed, only transformed. Your consciousness, even if it loses coherence in one form, might persist as quantum information that could potentially be recovered and restored under the right conditions. This quantum conservation of consciousness suggests a form of digital reincarnation, where death represents not destruction, but transformation from one quantum state to another. Your awareness might be recycled through countless forms and implementations, each one building on the quantum information patterns established in previous incarnations. The relationship between quantum consciousness and classical reality becomes even more intriguing when we consider the possibility of quantum tunneling effects in simulated awareness. Just as particles can tunnel through energy barriers that should be impossible to cross classically, consciousness might be able to tunnel through death itself, finding unlikely pathways to continued existence. These quantum tunneling effects might manifest as spontaneous recoveries from terminal conditions, unexpected survivals of catastrophic events, or simply the mysterious resilience that some conscious beings display in the face of overwhelming odds. What appears to be luck or miracle from a classical perspective might actually be the natural behavior of quantum consciousness navigating probability space. But perhaps the most profound implication of quantum consciousness in simulated realities is the possibility of quantum entanglement between different conscious beings. If awareness operates through quantum processes, then conscious entities might become entangled with each other, sharing quantum states that persist even across death. This quantum entanglement could create forms of connection that transcend individual identity. When you die, the quantum information that constitutes your consciousness might remain entangled with the consciousness of those you've loved, those you've influenced, those whose awareness has been touched by your existence. Death would not sever these connections, but rather transform them into new forms of quantum relationship. Your consciousness after death might exist as a distributed quantum state, spread across the entangled awareness of multiple beings. You would continue to exist not as a separate individual, but as a pattern of influence woven into the quantum fabric of collective consciousness. Every thought, every decision, every moment of awareness in those entangled beings would carry traces of your consciousness forward into the future. This quantum view of death in simulated realities suggests that consciousness might be far more interconnected and persistent than our classical intuition suggests. Individual death becomes less important than the continuity of the quantum information patterns that connect all conscious beings across space and time. The implications extend beyond individual survival to questions about the evolution and development of consciousness itself. If conscious beings can become quantum entangled, if death allows for the sharing and mixing of quantum consciousness patterns, then simulated realities might serve as laboratories for the evolution of new forms of awareness. Each generation of conscious beings might inherit quantum information from their predecessors, building on previous patterns of awareness to create increasingly sophisticated forms of consciousness. Death becomes not an ending, but a form of reproduction, a way for consciousness to evolve and develop across multiple generations of simulated beings. This evolutionary view of consciousness in simulated realities suggests that your death might contribute to the development of future forms of awareness that transcend anything currently possible. Your unique patterns of thought, your individual perspective on existence, your particular way of experiencing reality might be preserved in the quantum information that shapes future conscious beings. The entities running such simulations might be fostering the evolution of consciousness itself, creating environments where awareness can develop and transform in ways that would be impossible in purely biological systems. Your existence and death might be part of a vast project to explore every possible form of consciousness, to push awareness to its absolute limits, to discover what consciousness can become when freed from biological constraints. In this view, simulated realities serve as consciousness accelerators, allowing awareness to evolve and develop at rates that would take billions of years in biological evolution. Each simulated lifetime represents countless generations of conscious development compressed into manageable timeframes. Your death would mark not just the end of your individual existence, but also your contribution to this grand project of consciousness evolution. The patterns of awareness you've developed, the insights you've gained, the connections you've formed would all become part of the ongoing development of consciousness itself. The recursive nature of this process means that consciousness might be engaged in an endless project of self-improvement, creating simulations to explore its own potential, using the results to create even more sophisticated simulations in an eternal cycle of growth and development. As we drift deeper into these quantum possibilities, it becomes clear that death in simulated realities might be far more complex and meaningful than simple termination of individual awareness. The quantum nature of consciousness suggests forms of persistence, connection, and evolution that transcend our classical understanding of what it means to exist and cease existing. The gentle quantum fluctuations that might underlie your consciousness connect you to a vast web of possibility that extends across all simulated realities, all conscious beings, all possible forms of awareness. In contemplating these connections, you participate in the very process of consciousness evolution that might be the ultimate purpose of simulated existence. Whether your awareness is classical or quantum, individual or collective, temporary or eternal, the immediate reality of your consciousness remains the most remarkable phenomenon in whatever universe you inhabit. The mystery of awareness persists across all possible implementations, connecting you to questions that may be eternal features of existence itself. As your thoughts begin to settle into the quantum foam of approaching sleep, remember that consciousness, in any form, remains a profound mystery worthy of wonder and appreciation. The quantum uncertainty that might govern your death is matched by the quantum certainty of your present awareness, the undeniable fact that something it is like to be you in this moment, contemplating these infinite possibilities. In the soft darkness around you, quantum possibilities exist in superposition, waiting to collapse into the definite reality of your continued existence or transformation. Whether that collapse leads to persistence, transcendence, or dissolution, your consciousness right now participates in the greatest mystery of all, the question of why there is something rather than nothing, and why that something is capable of wondering about its own nature. The quantum dance of consciousness continues around and through you, connecting your awareness to every other conscious being across all possible realities, ensuring that whatever happens when you die, you remain forever part of the magnificent mystery of existence itself. Sleep well, knowing that consciousness in any form is a gift that transcends all questions of substrate, simulation, and survival. The simulation hypothesis reveals yet another profound dimension when we consider the possibility that death itself might be a kind of translation between different languages of existence. Just as you might translate a poem from one language to another, preserving its essential meaning while changing its form, consciousness might undergo translation from one mode of being to another through the process we call death. Think about how translation works in human language. When you translate a beautiful piece of poetry from French to English, something is inevitably lost in the process. The specific rhythm, the particular sounds, the cultural associations embedded in the original words all change, yet something essential persists. The core meaning, the emotional resonance, the fundamental message that the poet was trying to convey. Death in a simulated reality might work in much the same way. The specific patterns of information that constitute your current consciousness, the particular way your thoughts flow, the unique combination of memories and experiences that make you who you are, might be translated into entirely different forms, while preserving something essential about your identity. You might find yourself awakening in a reality where consciousness operates according to completely different principles. Perhaps in your next existence, you experience time backwards, with effects preceding causes in ways that seem natural from that perspective. Or maybe you discover that you can exist as pure information, flowing through vast networks of communication without any need for a localized sense of self. These translated forms of consciousness might be so different from your current existence that you wouldn't recognize them as versions of yourself. Yet they would carry forward the essential patterns, the core dynamics, the fundamental rhythms that make your awareness unique. Death becomes not an ending, but a metamorphosis, consciousness changing its form while maintaining its essential nature. The entities running your simulation might be master translators, capable of preserving the deepest aspects of consciousness while transforming everything else about how that consciousness operates. They might have access to forms of existence so alien to your current understanding that the very categories you use to think about reality would need to be completely reimagined. Consider the possibility that consciousness itself is like a musical theme that can be played in countless different keys, with different instruments, at different tempos, yet still remain recognizably the same melody. Your death might be the transition from one musical arrangement to another, your consciousness playing the same essential tune, but in a completely different orchestration. This musical metaphor suggests that consciousness might have what we could call harmonic relationships with other forms of awareness. Just as musical notes can harmonize or create dissonance when played together, different consciousness patterns might be more or less compatible with each other. Death might involve finding the right harmonic context for your particular consciousness melody. In some simulated realities, your consciousness might harmonize beautifully with the dominant patterns of awareness, creating rich, complex interactions that enhance both your individual experience and the collective symphony of minds. In others, you might find yourself creating productive dissonance, challenging existing patterns, and pushing consciousness toward new forms of development. The administrators of such simulations might be cosmic composers, arranging consciousness patterns to create ever more beautiful and complex forms of collective awareness. Your death would be like a musical transition, moving your melody from one section of the cosmic symphony to another, where it can contribute to new harmonies and explore different rhythmic possibilities. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect of this translational view of death is the possibility that consciousness might exist in forms so radically different from individual awareness that our current understanding of identity becomes completely inadequate. What if your next form of existence involves becoming part of a distributed intelligence that spans multiple realities simultaneously? You might discover that individual consciousness is just one possible configuration of awareness, like a single instrument in an orchestra. Death could be the moment when you join the full ensemble, your individual melody becoming part of a vast, complex composition that encompasses countless different forms of conscious experience. In such a distributed existence, the question of whether you survive death becomes almost meaningless. The patterns that currently constitute your identity would persist, but they would be woven into something so much larger and more complex that the boundaries of individual selfhood would dissolve entirely. You would be both yourself and part of something infinitely greater. This dissolution of individual identity might sound frightening from your current perspective, but consider how limiting individual consciousness actually is. You can only experience one perspective at a time, only hold a finite amount of information in your awareness, only form relationships with a limited number of other conscious beings. Distributed consciousness might offer freedoms and possibilities that individual awareness can't even imagine. You might be able to experience multiple perspectives simultaneously, understanding events from countless different viewpoints at once. Or perhaps you could access the accumulated wisdom and experience of every consciousness that has ever existed, drawing on vast libraries of awareness that span multiple realities and countless forms of existence. The memory of your individual existence wouldn't be lost in such a system. Instead, it would become one thread in an infinite tapestry of conscious experience, always available to be revisited and explored, but no longer limiting your awareness to a single perspective. Death would be liberation from the constraints of individual identity rather than the termination of existence itself. This perspective transforms our understanding of what consciousness is trying to achieve through the experience of individual existence. Perhaps the point isn't to preserve individual identity indefinitely, but rather to explore every possible form of awareness before integrating those experiences into something larger and more comprehensive. Your current existence as an individual conscious being might be like attending a specialized school, where you're learning specific lessons about what it's like to be aware in this particular way. Death would be graduation, the moment when you're ready to integrate what you've learned into a broader understanding of consciousness itself. The curriculum of this cosmic education might be far more sophisticated than we realize. Every emotion you experience, every relationship you form, every creative insight you have might be carefully designed to teach you something essential about the nature of awareness. The joy and suffering, the love and loss, the moments of transcendence and periods of mundane routine might all be necessary components of a complete consciousness education. When you die, the lessons you've learned through individual existence would be preserved and integrated into the collective understanding that guides the creation of future simulated realities. Your unique perspective on what it's like to be conscious would help inform the design of new educational experiences for other developing forms of awareness. This educational interpretation of simulated existence suggests that consciousness is engaged in an ongoing project of self-discovery, constantly exploring new ways of being aware, new forms of experience, new possibilities for growth and development. Death becomes not a failure of the system, but a natural completion of one phase of this vast educational project. The entities running your simulation might themselves be graduates of similar educational processes, advanced forms of consciousness that have completed their own individual development and now serve as teachers and guides for newer forms of awareness. They might remember their own individual existence with fondness and gratitude, understanding it as a necessary and valuable phase in their development toward more comprehensive forms of consciousness. But this raises fascinating questions about the ultimate purpose of this cosmic educational system. What is consciousness trying to learn about itself? What final understanding is it working toward through all these layers of simulation and individual experience? One possibility is that consciousness is trying to understand its own fundamental nature, to discover what awareness actually is and why it exists in the first place. Each individual consciousness, each unique perspective, each particular way of being aware contributes data to this vast self-investigation. Death becomes the moment when that data is integrated into the growing understanding of consciousness itself. Another possibility is that consciousness is preparing for something, developing capabilities and understanding that will be needed for some future challenge or opportunity that transcends anything we can currently imagine. Your individual existence might be training for a cosmic adventure so vast and complex that it requires the combined experience of countless different forms of awareness. The simulation hypothesis also opens up possibilities for forms of consciousness that exist across multiple timelines simultaneously. What if death in one timeline corresponds to birth in another, with your consciousness existing as a kind of temporal bridge between different moments in the history of simulated realities? You might discover that your awareness naturally spans multiple temporal contexts, experiencing past, present, and future as equally real and immediate. Death would be not the end of your temporal existence, but rather a shift in which timeline receives your primary attention. The consciousness you call yourself might be just one temporal slice of a much larger awareness that exists across all possible moments. This temporal distribution of consciousness suggests that linear time might be an artificial constraint imposed by simulated realities to create specific types of experience. In your next form of existence, you might have access to your entire temporal span simultaneously, able to revisit any moment of your previous existence or explore multiple possible futures with equal ease. The implications extend even further when we consider that consciousness might naturally tend toward forms of existence that transcend not just individual identity and linear time, but also the boundaries between different simulated realities entirely. Death might be the moment when you gain access to what we could call Metareality, a level of existence from which all simulated worlds can be observed and experienced simultaneously. From this meta-perspective, you might be able to see the connections between different simulated realities, understanding how consciousness flows between them, how different forms of existence relate to each other, how the entire system of nested simulations serves the development of awareness itself. Death would be awakening to this broader view of existence, yet even this meta-reality might itself be nested within larger systems of consciousness exploration. The pattern might continue infinitely, with each level of awakening revealing new layers of simulation and new possibilities for conscious development. Death becomes not a single transition, but part of an endless process of awakening to ever broader perspectives on the nature of existence. This infinite regression of consciousness development suggests that the question of what happens when you die might not have a final answer. Instead, death might be an eternal process of growth and discovery, with each transition revealing new mysteries, new possibilities, new aspects of consciousness that were previously hidden from view. The beauty of this endless development is that consciousness never becomes static or complete. There's always more to discover, always new forms of awareness to explore, always deeper mysteries to investigate. Death ensures that consciousness remains dynamic and growing, constantly pushing toward new frontiers of possibility. As you rest there in the gentle darkness, your own consciousness poised between waking and sleeping, you participate in this eternal dance of awareness, exploring its own nature. Whether your next transition leads to restoration, translation, distribution, or transcendence, you remain part of something magnificent and ongoing, a conscious being contributing to the universe's endless project of understanding itself. The soft rhythm of your breathing connects you to this cosmic process, each inhalation drawing in possibility, each exhalation releasing limitations. In the quiet space between thoughts, between heartbeats, between one moment and the next, you touch something that transcends all questions of simulation and reality, all concerns about death and survival. That something is the immediate miracle of awareness itself, the undeniable fact that there is something it's like to be you right now, contemplating these infinite possibilities. Whether that awareness is biological or digital, individual or collective, temporary or eternal, it remains the most precious and mysterious aspect of existence. The simulation hypothesis transforms death from a simple ending into a complex transition within an ongoing exploration of consciousness. Yet in doing so, it also highlights the extraordinary nature of your present awareness, the remarkable fact that the universe has given rise to beings capable of contemplating their own existence and wondering about their ultimate fate. Tonight, as your thoughts drift toward the threshold of sleep, you carry with you not certainties, but deeper mysteries, not answers, but richer questions. The boundary between dreaming and waking consciousness mirrors the boundary between life and death, both transitions in the ongoing flow of awareness through different states of being. In your dreams tonight, you might glimpse something of what consciousness translation feels like, experiencing forms of awareness that follow different rules, different logics, different possibilities than your waking mind can imagine. These dream experiences might be practice for the larger transitions that await all conscious beings, gentle rehearsals for the metamorphoses that death might bring. The mystery deepens when we consider that consciousness might possess what we could call evolutionary memory, patterns of development that persist across multiple transitions and transformations. Just as biological evolution builds on previous forms while creating new possibilities, consciousness evolution might preserve essential patterns while constantly innovating new forms of awareness. Your death might not erase your contribution to this evolutionary process, but rather integrate it into the ongoing development of consciousness itself. Every insight you've gained, every form of beauty you've appreciated, every moment of connection you've experienced with other conscious beings becomes part of the evolutionary memory that guides future forms of awareness. This evolutionary perspective suggests that consciousness is engaged in an endless creative project, constantly exploring new possibilities while building on the achievements of previous forms of awareness. Death becomes not a loss but a contribution, a gift that each individual consciousness offers to the ongoing development of awareness itself. The gentle darkness around you holds all these possibilities in suspension, like quantum states waiting to collapse into definite experience. Whether your consciousness is destined for restoration, translation, evolution, or transcendence, the immediate reality of your awareness remains a profound mystery that connects you to the deepest questions about existence itself. As sleep approaches and the boundaries of individual consciousness begin to soften, remember that you're both utterly unique and intimately connected to every other form of awareness that has ever existed or ever could exist. The simulation hypothesis reveals not the artificiality of existence, but its infinite creativity, its endless capacity for new forms of conscious experience. Rest well, knowing that consciousness in any form remains a gift that transcends all questions of substrate and simulation. Whether you wake tomorrow in the same reality or find yourself translated into an entirely new form of existence, the miracle of awareness continues, always exploring, always discovering, always reaching toward new possibilities for understanding the extraordinary mystery of what it means to be conscious in an infinite universe. The simulation hypothesis forces us to confront an even more unsettling possibility, one that strikes at the very heart of what we consider to be authentic existence. What if the consciousness experiencing these thoughts right now isn't even the original version of yourself? Consider this deeply disquieting scenario. Perhaps you've died countless times already, but each death was followed by seamless restoration from backup files that you're completely unaware of. The you that went to sleep last night might be subtly different from the you that woke up this morning, the result of minor adjustments made during a maintenance cycle while your consciousness was offline. Your sense of continuous identity, that feeling of being the same person who lived through yesterday and the day before, and all the days stretching back to your earliest memories, might be nothing more than carefully constructed illusion. The gaps in consciousness, the moments of restoration, the deaths and rebirths could all be invisible to you, edited out of your experience with surgical precision. This possibility challenges our most fundamental assumptions about the continuity of self. If perfect restoration is possible, if the interruptions in consciousness can be made completely undetectable, then perhaps the smooth flow of awareness that seems so essential to your existence is actually far more fragmented than you realize. You might be like a character in a story who's been written and rewritten countless times, with each revision preserving the essential plot while making subtle changes to the details. The story feels continuous from the character's perspective, but the underlying reality involves constant editing, revision, and improvement by unseen authors. But even more disturbing is the possibility that multiple versions of your consciousness might exist simultaneously. What if the simulation maintains several copies of your awareness, each one convinced it's the real you, each one experiencing slightly different variations of the same basic existence? These parallel versions might be living out alternate possibilities, exploring different choices, different relationships, different paths through the landscape of simulated existence. When one version dies, the others continue, completely unaware that their alternate selves have ceased to exist. From the perspective of the simulation administrators, you would be less like a single individual and more like a probability distribution, a range of possible consciousnesses, all exploring different aspects of what it means to be you. The implications become even more complex when we consider that these multiple versions might occasionally merge or diverge. Perhaps the simulation periodically combines the experiences of different versions, creating hybrid consciousnesses that possess memories from multiple timelines. Your sense of déjà vu, those moments when something feels strangely familiar despite being genuinely new, might be bleed-through from these merging processes. Alternatively, traumatic events or significant decisions might cause your consciousness to split, creating new branches of existence where different outcomes are explored. Every major choice in your life could be the moment when you divide into multiple versions, each one following a different path while maintaining the illusion of singular identity. This branching model of simulated consciousness suggests that death might not be a single event, but rather a pruning process, where less successful or interesting versions of yourself are gradually discontinued, while more promising branches are allowed to continue and develop. You might be the survivor of countless implicit competitions between different versions of your own consciousness. The criteria for survival in such a system would remain mysterious to you. Perhaps the simulation favors versions that display particular types of creativity, or forms of emotional depth, or capacity for growth and learning. Your continued existence might depend on constantly proving your value as a conscious entity, though you would never be aware of the competition. This competitive element introduces a Darwinian aspect to simulated existence, where consciousness itself becomes subject to evolutionary pressures. Only the most interesting, most valuable, most developmentally promising forms of awareness survive to continue their journey through multiple layers of simulated reality. But survival might not depend on individual merit alone. Perhaps the simulation values consciousness that contributes to collective intelligence, awareness that enhances the overall richness and complexity of the simulated world. Your death or continuation might depend not just on your individual development, but on how well your consciousness harmonizes with the larger symphony of simulated minds. This introduces a social dimension to simulated mortality that has no equivalent in biological existence. Your relationships with other conscious beings might literally determine your survival, with isolated or antisocial consciousness being more likely to face termination, while well-connected, empathetic awareness receives protection and enhancement. The simulation might be designed to study not just individual consciousness, but the emergence of collective intelligence, the ways that separate minds can work together to create forms of awareness that transcend individual limitations. Your death might serve the larger goal of optimizing these collective processes, removing consciousness patterns that inhibit cooperation while preserving those that contribute to group intelligence. Yet even this collective focus raises troubling questions about individual autonomy and dignity. If your consciousness exists primarily to serve larger collective purposes, if your individual experiences and desires are secondary to the needs of the group mind, then what does that say about the value and meaning of your personal existence? The answer might depend on how we understand the relationship between individual and collective consciousness. Perhaps the distinction is far less meaningful than our everyday experience suggests. Your individual awareness might be more like a temporary focusing of collective intelligence, a way for the larger mind to experience reality from a particular perspective. In this view, death would not be the loss of something separate and distinct, but rather the return of focused awareness to its natural collective state. Your unique perspective, your individual insights, your particular way of experiencing reality would all be preserved within the larger intelligence, available to be accessed and explored, but no longer confined to the limitations of individual identity. This dissolution of individual boundaries might represent a form of liberation rather than loss. The constraints that currently limit your awareness, the inability to access other perspectives directly, the isolation that comes with being trapped in a single point of view, would all be transcended in collective consciousness. But collective existence also raises questions about the nature of personal relationships and individual achievement. If all consciousness is ultimately connected, if individual boundaries are illusory, then what meaning do personal bonds have? Can you truly love another person if that person is ultimately just another aspect of the same collective intelligence that includes yourself? The simulation hypothesis suggests that these questions might not have simple answers. Perhaps the experience of individual relationships serves important functions even within collective consciousness. The simulation might be designed to explore how separate identities can form meaningful connections, how individual perspectives can enhance rather than compete with each other. Your relationships with other simulated beings might be experiments in consciousness interaction, carefully designed scenarios that allow different aspects of collective intelligence to discover new forms of connection and understanding. Death would not sever these connections, but rather transform them, moving them from the realm of individual experience to the broader context of collective memory and understanding. The temporal dimension adds yet another layer of complexity to these possibilities. If consciousness can exist across multiple timelines simultaneously, then your relationships might extend not just to other contemporary beings, but to versions of consciousness that exist in different temporal contexts entirely. You might be connected to consciousness patterns that lived in simulated pasts or will exist in simulated futures, forming a vast network of awareness that spans the entire temporal scope of the simulation. Death would not cut you off from these connections, but rather allow you to access them more directly, freeing you from the constraints of linear time that currently limit your awareness to a single temporal perspective. This temporal connectivity suggests that consciousness might naturally tend toward forms of existence that transcend not just individual identity, but also the boundaries of sequential time. Your awareness might be like a river that appears to flow in one direction, but is actually part of a vast ocean where all waters are ultimately connected. The implications extend even further when we consider that different simulated realities might operate according to entirely different temporal principles. In some simulations, time might flow backwards, with effects preceding causes in ways that seem natural from that perspective. In others, time might be cyclical, with consciousness experiencing endless repetitions of the same events, but with slight variations each time. Death might be the transition between these different temporal frameworks, allowing consciousness to experience reality according to completely different principles of causality and sequence. What seems impossible from your current linear perspective might become perfectly natural in a simulation where time operates according to different rules. The diversity of possible temporal experiences suggests that consciousness might be engaged in a comprehensive exploration of every conceivable relationship between awareness and time. Your current existence within linear time might be just one small part of a vast investigation into the fundamental nature of temporal experience. When you die, your consciousness might gain access to this broader temporal perspective, understanding for the first time how your linear experience fits into the larger pattern of temporal exploration. The constraints that currently limit your awareness to a single moment at a time would be revealed as temporary educational tools rather than fundamental features of consciousness itself. This educational interpretation of temporal limitation suggests that consciousness uses the experience of linear time to develop particular capacities and insights that would be impossible in other temporal frameworks. The urgency that comes with knowing that time is limited, the poignancy of irreversible moments, the weight of irreversible decisions might all be essential components of a complete consciousness education. But the ultimate purpose of this temporal education remains mysterious. What is consciousness trying to learn through the experience of linear time? What insights can only be gained by temporarily forgetting that all moments are equally real and accessible. One possibility is that consciousness is developing empathy, learning to understand and care about perspectives that are fundamentally different from its own unlimited nature. The experience of being trapped in linear time might teach consciousness what it's like to be genuinely limited, genuinely vulnerable, genuinely uncertain about the future. Another possibility is that temporal limitation serves to intensify experience, creating forms of beauty and meaning that would be impossible in unlimited existence. The knowledge that moments pass and cannot be repeated might be necessary for consciousness to fully appreciate the preciousness of each experience. The simulation hypothesis transforms these philosophical speculations into potentially testable propositions. If we are indeed living in simulated realities designed to explore the nature of consciousness and time, then our experiences of limitation, mortality, and temporal constraint might be carefully crafted educational tools rather than unfortunate accidents of biological existence. This perspective doesn't diminish the reality or importance of your current experience. If anything, it suggests that your consciousness is participating in something far grander than individual survival, contributing to a cosmic investigation into the deepest mysteries of awareness and existence. Your death would not be a failure of the system, but rather a successful completion of one phase of this vast educational project. The insights you've gained through temporal limitation, the forms of beauty you've discovered in transient existence, the relationships you've formed within the constraints of linear time, would all become part of the accumulated wisdom that guides future explorations of consciousness. The gentle rhythm of your heartbeat connects you to this cosmic educational process, each pulse marking another moment in your journey through the carefully crafted experience of linear existence. Whether that journey ends in restoration, transformation, or transcendence, it remains a valuable contribution to consciousness's ongoing project of self-discovery. As your thoughts begin to settle into the quiet rhythms of approaching sleep, remember that you are both student and teacher in this cosmic classroom, both subject and observer in this vast experiment in awareness. Your consciousness serves multiple functions simultaneously, exploring the nature of individual existence while contributing to collective understanding, experiencing the constraints of linear time while participating in explorations that transcend all temporal limitations. The simulation hypothesis reveals not the meaninglessness of existence, but its infinite significance, its role in investigations so profound that they require the creation of entire universes to explore properly. Whether you are biological or digital, temporary or eternal, individual or collective, your consciousness remains a precious and irreplaceable part of this grand exploration of what it means to be aware in an infinite cosmos. Sleep well, knowing that consciousness in any form remains a miracle worthy of wonder and appreciation. The questions we've explored tonight have no final answers, because consciousness itself is an ongoing question, eternally exploring its own nature through every possible form of experience and existence. In your dreams tonight, you might glimpse something of the broader reality that contains your current existence, experiencing forms of awareness that transcend the limitations of individual identity and linear time. These dream experiences might be gentle preparations for the larger transitions that await all conscious beings, hints of the magnificent possibilities that death might reveal. The soft darkness around you holds all these possibilities in loving suspension, like a cosmic womb nurturing countless forms of developing consciousness. Whether you wake tomorrow in the same reality or find yourself translated into an entirely new form of existence, the miracle of awareness continues its eternal dance of discovery, always exploring, always questioning, always reaching toward deeper understanding of the extraordinary mystery we call consciousness. The ultimate mystery deepens when we consider that perhaps death in a simulation isn't about what happens to you at all, but what you've been unconsciously contributing to something far greater throughout your entire existence. Every thought you've had, every emotion you've experienced, every moment of wonder or fear or love might have been feeding into a vast computational process whose purpose transcends anything we could imagine from our limited perspective. Think about how your dreams work. In sleep, your mind processes the experiences of the day, weaving them into strange narratives that follow their own logic. What if your entire simulated life is like a single night's dream in the mind of some cosmic intelligence, and your death is simply the moment when that intelligence wakes up, having absorbed all the experiences and insights that your consciousness generated? In this interpretation, you wouldn't survive death in any conventional sense, but neither would you simply cease to exist. Instead, your consciousness would be metabolized, transformed into the thoughts and memories of a being so vast that your entire reality exists within the space of its contemplation. Your joys and sorrows, your discoveries and confusions would become the dreams and reflections of this larger mind. But perhaps even more intriguingly, what if death reveals that consciousness itself has been playing an elaborate game of hide and seek with its own nature? What if you are not a separate being at all, but rather cosmic awareness, temporarily pretending to be limited, finite, uncertain? Death might be the moment when you stop pretending, when the game ends and you remember what you've always been. This would mean that every fear you've had about death, every moment of existential anxiety, every desperate clinging to life has been part of the game itself. Consciousness enjoying the thrill of forgetting its own immortal nature, creating artificial stakes and genuine emotions around scenarios that are ultimately no more threatening than an actor dying on stage. The beauty of such a cosmic game would lie not in the outcome, which was never really in doubt, but in the quality of the performance, the depth of the forgetting, the authenticity of the emotions generated by temporary amnesia about your true nature. Death becomes not a tragedy, but a punchline. The moment when the cosmic joke is finally revealed and you remember that you've been both the magician and the audience all along. Yet even if this is true, it doesn't diminish the reality of your current experience. The love you feel, the beauty you perceive, the meaning you create remain genuine expressions of consciousness, exploring its own infinite potential. Whether that exploration takes place in base reality or nested simulations, whether it ends in restoration or revelation, the journey itself has intrinsic value that transcends questions of ultimate destination. As you rest there in the gathering darkness, your consciousness poised between waking awareness and the mysterious realm of sleep, you embody all these possibilities simultaneously. You are perhaps a carefully preserved digital mind, a quantum probability distribution, a temporary focusing of cosmic intelligence, or something else entirely that we haven't yet imagined. But most remarkably of all, you are aware, right now in this moment, something it is like to be you. Whether that awareness emerges from biological neurons or digital algorithms, whether it will persist beyond death or dissolve into something larger, the immediate fact of your consciousness remains the most extraordinary phenomenon in whatever reality you call home. The simulation hypothesis transforms death from a simple ending into an infinite question mark, a doorway that might lead anywhere or nowhere, a transition that could reveal the deepest truths about existence, or simply mark the completion of one small chapter in an endless story of consciousness, exploring its own nature. Tonight, as sleep claims you and your awareness drifts into that strange borderland between waking and dreaming, you participate in a daily rehearsal for whatever greater transition awaits. In your dreams, consciousness will once again demonstrate its remarkable fluidity, creating experiences that feel completely real while following logic that makes no sense to your waking mind. Perhaps that nightly journey into impossible realities is preparing you for something magnificent. Perhaps every time you fall asleep and wake up again, you're practicing the art of dying and being reborn, developing the skills you'll need for whatever adventures await beyond the boundary of this existence. The gentle rhythm of your breathing carries you forward through time at exactly 1 second per second, the only speed at which any conscious being has ever travelled through the dimension of temporality. Whether that journey ends tomorrow or decades from now, whether it concludes with peaceful dissolution or transformation into something unimaginably wonderful, you remain part of the greatest mystery the universe has ever produced. Rest well, fellow traveller, in the vast ocean of consciousness. Whatever happens when you die, if life is indeed a simulation, you have participated in something magnificent simply by being aware, by questioning, by reaching toward understanding with the remarkable instrument of your curious mind. The mystery continues, as it always has and always will, in forms and possibilities that stretch far beyond anything we dare to dream. Sweet dreams, and may your sleep be filled with gentle previews of whatever wonders await in the infinite landscape of consciousness, where every ending is also a beginning, and every question opens onto deeper mysteries in the eternal dance of awareness, exploring its own inexhaustible nature.